I was 20 when my family decided I was no longer worth keeping. There was no dramatic build-up, no long argument that stretched into the night. Just a short, heavy silence at the dinner table, my mother's eyes fixed on her plate, my father's jaw tight with a disappointment he had rehearsed for weeks. When I finally said the truth out loud, who I was, who I loved, the room seemed to shrink. My father stood up, pointed toward the door, and said I had made my choice. By morning, I was told to leave. No hugs. No money. Only a warning not to come back until I learned how to be normal. My name is Ethan Cole, and that night I learned how quickly love can turn conditional. That I left with a backpack that smelled like dust and old notebooks, my phone at 5%, and a hollow feeling in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The street outside our house looked the same as it always had, but I felt like a stranger walking through it. Every step away from the front door felt permanent. I didn't cry at first. Shock has a way of numbing everything, even pain. The first few days blurred together. I slept on a friend's couch until the unspoken discomfort became too loud to ignore. I learned which convenience stores didn't mind if you stayed too long and which coffee shops let you refill water without asking questions. At night, I replayed my father's words in my head, wondering how honesty had turned me into an outsider in my own home. I wasn't reckless or lazy. I just wanted to exist without lying. By the end of the first week, survival replaced self-pity. I printed copies of my resume at the library, each page slightly crooked, and walked into offices where no one looked at me twice. I smiled, shook hands, and promised reliability, even though I wasn't sure how long I could keep pretending I wasn't terrified. Rejection became routine. Some places never called back. Others said they'd found someone more suitable. I stopped asking what that meant. The interview at Harrington Solutions was different from the moment I stepped inside. The building didn't scream wealth, it whispered it. Clean lines, quiet halls, and an atmosphere that demanded calm. I almost turned around before reaching the front desk, convinced I didn't belong there. But desperation has a way of pushing you forward. Victor Harrington met me in a glass-walled office on the top floor. He was taller than I expected, dressed simply, with an expression that seemed permanently thoughtful. His handshake was firm but not dismissive. When he asked me to sit, he actually waited until I did. That small courtesy caught me off guard. He skimmed my resume in silence, then looked up at me. "You're young," he said, not unkindly. "And you've moved around a lot recently." I told him the truth, carefully edited. I said I'd left home. I said I was willing to work hard. I didn't mention why I'd been kicked out or how close I was to running out of places to sleep. Victor listened without interrupting, his attention steady in a way that made me feel seen rather than examined. "You don't have much experience," he said finally. "I learn fast," I replied. "And I don't quit." Something shifted in his expression, subtle but real. He asked me about my goals, my strengths, the kind of work I enjoyed. No one had asked me those questions since I'd left home. By the time the interview ended, my hands had stopped shaking. 2 hours later, I received a call offering me a junior administrative position. I stared at my phone in disbelief, rereading the email until the words felt solid. It wasn't just a job. It was a lifeline. Working for Victor changed the rhythm of my days. I had a desk, a schedule, and a reason to wake up in the morning. He was demanding but fair, precise in his expectations, and surprisingly patient when I made mistakes. He noticed effort. He rewarded honesty. In his presence, I wasn't the boy my family had rejected, I was an employee who mattered. Over time, small details began to stand out. The way Victor stayed late even when his calendar was clear. The untouched coffee growing cold on his desk. The brief pauses when personal questions came up in conversation. I told myself not to read into it. This was professionalism, nothing more. One evening, while organizing files in his office, I noticed a framed photo turned slightly away from view. It showed Victor standing beside another man, both dressed formally, both smiling for the camera. A silver band caught the light on Victor's hand. Married. The realization settled quietly but firmly in my mind. Later that week, Victor mentioned his husband in passing. "Daniel works in finance," he said, as if reciting a fact rather than sharing a piece of his life. There was no warmth in his voice, no resentment either. Just distance that I told myself it didn't matter. Victor was my employer, nothing more. Gratitude, I reasoned, could easily be mistaken for attachment if I wasn't careful. Still, I couldn't ignore how safe I felt around him, how different that safety was from anything I'd known before. He hadn't rescued me, but he had given me room to stand on my own again. On my first payday, I sat alone in my small rented room and held the envelope for a long time before opening it. The amount wasn't extraordinary, but to me it felt like proof that I could survive without begging for acceptance. I sent a message to my mother that I never expected her to answer. I told her I was working. That I was okay. She didn't reply. The next morning, as I walked into the office, Victor nodded at me from across the room, a simple gesture of acknowledgement. In that moment, I felt something I didn't yet have a name for, a quiet pull, dangerous in its comfort. I didn't know then how thin the line was between gratitude and longing, or how easily stability could turn into temptation. I only knew that my life had begun to hinge on a man who was already bound to someone else, and that realization lingered with me long after the day's work was done. The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that felt almost peaceful. I arrived early, left late, and learned how to anticipate Victor Harrington's needs before he voiced them. He noticed. A quiet "thank you" here, an approving nod there. Each acknowledgement fed a part of me that had been starved for a long time. I told myself this was normal, that anyone in my position would feel loyal to the person who had given them a second chance. Still, there were moments that unsettled me. Victor often lingered after hours, staring out at the city as if it held answers he refused to ask for. When I gathered my things to leave, he would sometimes ask me to stay a few minutes longer, not for work, but for conversation. We spoke about books, about travel, about how strange it felt to wake up one day and realize your life had gone in a direction you never planned. He never mentioned Daniel during those moments, and I never asked. One evening, rain pressed hard against the windows, blurring the skyline into streaks of light. The office was nearly empty. I was finishing a report when Victor sighed and loosened his tie, a gesture that felt unguarded. "Do you ever feel," he asked, choosing his words carefully, "that you're living a version of yourself that no longer fits?" I hesitated. Honesty had cost me everything once already. But something in his tone felt safe. "Every day," I said. "But sometimes it takes losing everything to find out who you really are." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "That sounds right." From then on, our conversations carried a different weight. Victor didn't cross any obvious lines, yet the air between us grew heavier, charged with things left unsaid. I became more aware of his presence, how his voice softened when he spoke to me, how his eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary. I tried to ignore it, reminding myself that this was my job, my stability. I couldn't afford to complicate it. Daniel Harrington entered my life on a Friday afternoon. He arrived unannounced, impeccably dressed, his smile polished and distant. Victor introduced us with professional ease. Daniel shook my hand, his grip firm but impersonal, his gaze flicking briefly around the office as if assessing a space he rarely occupied. They exchanged a few words about schedules and an upcoming event, their conversation efficient, almost rehearsed. Watching them together was disorienting. They looked like a couple that made sense on paper, successful, composed, respectable. Yet something essential seemed absent. There was no shared warmth, no ease. When Daniel left, Victor exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding all day. That I told myself not to analyze it. Other people's marriages were not my concern. That resolve weakened the night Victor asked me to join him for dinner. He framed it as work-related, a discussion about upcoming projects. The restaurant was quiet, intimate without being romantic. Conversation flowed easily, then drifted into more personal territory. Victor spoke about the early days of his marriage, about ambition and compromise, about how success sometimes arrived hand in hand with loneliness. I don't regret my choices, he said, staring into his glass. But I wonder who I might have been if I'd allowed myself to want differently. The words settled between us, heavy with implication. My chest tightened. I was painfully aware of the power imbalance between us, his wealth, his authority, my dependence. Yet I also felt seen in a way that terrified me. That night, nothing happened. No touch, no confession. But when we parted, the space between us felt altered, thinner, more fragile. The following days were marked by restraint. Victor became more formal at work, almost distant, as if trying to reassert boundaries. I appreciated the effort, even as it left me unsettled. Part of me missed the openness we'd shared, another part feared where it could lead. The tension broke unexpectedly. We were alone in the office late again, an approaching deadline keeping us tethered to our desks. Victor looked up from his screen and said my name, not sharply, but with a vulnerability that made me look up immediately. Ethan, he said, I need to be honest with you. My pulse quickened. Honesty had always been a turning point in my life, rarely a gentle one. I've grown too comfortable relying on you, he continued. Not just professionally. He stopped, searching my face. That's not fair to you. Or to Daniel. The room felt unbearably quiet. I could have reassured him, insisted it was nothing. Instead, the truth slipped out before I could stop it. I don't feel like just an employee when I'm with you, I admitted. And that scares me. The admission hung between us, undeniable and irreversible. Victor closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing himself. When he opened them, there was regret there, and something else, longing, restrained by years of discipline. We can't continue like this, he said. But I don't want to pretend it doesn't exist. Neither did I. Yet acknowledging it meant accepting my role in something that could hurt more than just the two of us. That night, I went home and lay awake, replaying every word, every glance. I wondered whether my feelings were born of genuine connection or shaped by gratitude and need. I wondered if Victor's were any different. The next morning, I arrived at work resolved to create distance. Victor greeted me politely, professionally. The boundary was back in place, visible and firm. Still, when our eyes met across the room, I felt the same pull as before, stronger now because it was forbidden. Nothing had been resolved. If anything, the truth had complicated everything. I understood then that this was no simple attraction, no harmless crush. It was the beginning of a conflict that would demand choices from both of us, choices that could redefine loyalty, integrity, and the fragile sense of belonging I had only just begun to rebuild.